Their own father was sterilized by the Inbred sisters. That's the scary truth that can be found in the records of Havenwood Hollow from 1881. Three sisters, Ara, Mave, and Willa Ross, lived under the iron fist of a man the town called a holy church elder. But behind closed doors, Silas Ross was orchestrating something far more twisted than anyone could imagine. For many years, the Ross family had what locals called the curse: stillbirths, seizures, and early deaths. Everyone said it was God's anger. But when Willa, who was 17, fell down in violent convulsions, her sister Ara broke into their father's locked study. What she found in those old ledgers changed everything. Years of planned inbreeding, first cousins being forced to marry, and notes that hinted at something even worse: Silas's own relationships with his sisters. The people in town knew something was wrong. The law didn't do anything. Three desperate sisters knew that only they could save themselves. But how far is too far when righteous anger meets planned revenge? In 1881, the autumn wind that blew through Havenwood Hollow brought with it the smell of dying leaves and secrets that the valley had kept hidden for far too long. Nestled deep in a secluded cleft between towering hills, the community of barely 300 souls lived by unspoken rules and carefully maintained silences. The Ross family was in a strange position among them. They were respected for going to church and feared for their cursed bloodline at the same time. Silas Ross was 6 feet tall and wore his best clothes on Sunday. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and looked out the window of his small farmhouse. At 52, his dark hair was starting to turn gray at the temples, which gave him an air of distinguished authority that helped him as church elder during his weekly sermons. People in town saw a man of God who was dedicated to his family and the Bible. They felt sorry for him because he had 3 daughters and a history of what they called bad blood. People whispered about the Ross curse in parlors and talked about it quietly after Sunday service. For 3 generations, the family had to deal with stillbirths that happened too often, kids born with twisted limbs or cloudy minds, and deaths that took young people too soon. Sarah Ross was the most recent victim. She died in pain 7 years ago while giving birth to a son who took only 3 gasping breaths before joining his mother in the grave. That left Silas to raise his 3 living daughters on his own, which he did with the same strict discipline he used for his biblical studies. Ara, who was 22, had her mother's auburn hair and green eyes, but she also had her mother's fierce sense of duty to protect others that had grown stronger since her mother died. She moved around the house like a guardian spirit, taking care of her younger sisters with a love that was almost motherly. Maeve, 19, and with dark skin like their fathers, had learned early on that staying quiet was the key to staying alive. With eyes that looked older than her years, she took note of every harsh word and raised hand in the careful ledger of her memory. And then there was Willa, 17 and as fragile as spun glass. Her skin was too pale, and her hands shook sometimes, which showed how sick her family was. The house smelled like apple butter and Ara's voice reading from the book of Psalms that morning when Willa fell. They did it every day, starting after breakfast and ending when their father left for work in the fields. While Willa worked on her embroidery and Maeve fixed a torn apron, Maeve's fingers stayed steady even though she was weak. The seizure came out of nowhere, violently and terribly, turning the sweet girl into a writhing stranger with an impossibly arched back and eyes that rolled white like winter snow. Ara had seen things like this before, in her mother during the last few terrible months and in her brother Thomas before he died at 12. She knew what to look for: the way consciousness left first, then the horrible stiffness that gripped the limbs, and finally the convulsions that seemed to rip the soul from the body. But knowing didn't make it any less horrible to watch her youngest sister suffer from the same disease that had killed their mother. When Dr. Harwick finally got there, he had a black bag in his hands that smelled like carbolic acid and whiskey. He told the Ross family the same thing he had told them every time something bad happened: the curse of bad blood, punishment for sins that were unknown and beyond the reach of medical science. He gave laudanum for the pain and prayer for the soul. And then he left quickly, as if he wanted to get away from the damned as soon as possible. That night, Ara couldn't sleep because Willa was sick and lying still in the bed they shared. The house creaked around her with sounds she knew, but underneath them she heard something else. Her father's footsteps in the hallway, stopping outside their door for longer than was polite. The sound made her feel a cold, unnameable fear that their family's curse went deeper than bad crops or God's anger. When Silas's footsteps finally faded away, Aura slipped out from under the quilts like a daughter who had done it before. The floorboards knew how heavy she was and gave way quietly as she walked down the narrow stairs to her father's study, a room she had been told not to go into since she was a child. The lock opened when she used a hairpin with all her might, and she found herself surrounded by the simple furniture of a man who valued order above all else. The ledger was hidden behind a row of religious books that were bound in cracked leather and full of her father's neat writing. Page after page told the story of their family, in the same careful handwriting as a scientist writing down the results of an experiment. Birth dates, death dates, marriage records, and so on. But as Aura read the spider-like notes, her hands started to shake with a fear that was worse than Willa's seizure. These were the unions that had led to their cursed family tree. First cousins marrying first cousins, generation after generation, against the law and nature. Mary, her great-grandmother, married her cousin Jacob. Ruth, her grandmother, married her first cousin, Samuel. The pattern was planned, and carefully bred to keep the Ross bloodline pure and the Ross property in the family. But the notes in the margins were even worse. They were cryptic references that made her stomach turn with their implications. Dates that matched births with no marriages recorded, children claimed by men who shared their blood too closely for God or nature to bless, and most damning of all, a series of entries in her father's hand that spoke of his own sisters, his own contributions to the family's twisted legacy before their deaths, in what the records called unfortunate accidents. As the first light of dawn began to come through the study's only window, the terrible math of their lives became clear. Their curse was not a punishment from God, but a design by humans. It was a horrible experiment in which her father was both the architect and a participant. Keeping the Ross bloodline to itself, twisted into shapes that nature never intended, had cost them every stillbirth, every deformity, and every early death. Aura knew that she didn't just have family records in the ledger. She had proof of a crime so terrible that it had poisoned 3 generations and would keep going unless she found the courage to do something about it. The dawn that came after Era's terrible discovery didn't help. It just made her feel worse, as if the knowledge she had was going to suffocate her with its implications. She went through the morning rituals like a woman who was asleep, making breakfast with hands that knew what to do, while her mind was still spinning from what she had read in her father's ledger. When Silas left for the fields, Aura could hear his heavy boots thudding across the wooden porch in their usual way. She knew she could no longer bear the burden of truth alone. Maeve sat in the kitchen chair where their mother used to shell peas. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly from a face that had learned early on not to show what she was thinking. She was fixing one of Willa's nightgowns, and her needle moved in the exact, efficient way that someone who had to make every thread count would do. But Aura saw that her sister's hand stopped moving when she heard their father's footsteps fade, and her shoulders seemed to relax, as if they were carrying a heavy weight. Once she started, the words came out in a flood, spilling from her lips like a confession that had to be made. She told Maeve everything, how they weren't allowed to go into their father's study, how the ledger kept track of their family's messed up history, and how they were purposely growing what the town called their curse. She saw her sister's face change from careful blankness to something much more dangerous, recognition, as she spoke. When Aura was done telling her story, the kitchen was quiet, except for the steady ticking of their mother's clock and the lowing of cows in the pasture. Maeve put down her needle and thread with such controlled movements that they looked almost like a ritual. Then she looked at her older sister with eyes that Aura had never seen before. "I know," Maeve said in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but held the weight of years of hidden knowledge. "I have always known something was wrong, but I could never name it. The way he looks at us, especially at Willa, the way his hands linger when he thinks we are not watching, the excuses he finds to enter our room at night, claiming concern for her health. The admission hung between them like a blade. cutting through the last vestiges of the innocence that had protected them from fully understanding their situation. Era felt something in her chest break open, letting out a flood of memories she had tried to forget. Their father's lingering hugs, his insistence on bathing them, long after they should have been too old for it, and the way his breathing changed when he watched them get ready for church. What she thought was a father's love turned out to be something much worse. Maeve's voice got stronger with each word as she said, "He has been preparing Willa, testing her limits, and breaking down her resistance little by little, just like he did with our mother. I think he did the same thing with his sisters before they died in those convenient accidents." Era's first instinct was to march to the sheriff's office in town to demand justice for the crimes detailed in their father's own handwriting. But she knew that the thought was pointless, even as it came to her. Sheriff Morrison was a church board member and Silas's hunting buddy. He was a man who valued social harmony above all else. Women who tried to speak out against powerful men in Havenwood Hollow were called hysterics, or worse, and their reputations were ruined, and their families were shunned. Also, Silas Ross wasn't just any man in their community. He was an elder, a moral authority figure whose Sunday sermons got a lot of nods of approval from the people who heard them. His carefully crafted image of being a devoted Christian and a father who made sacrifices would make any accusation from his daughters seem like the desperate lies of ungrateful kids who want to hurt their benefactor. The same isolation that let him commit his crimes would also keep him safe from their effects. "They will never believe us," Maeve said, echoing Ara's thoughts, with the wisdom of someone who had spent years watching how men use their power. "And even if they did, what then? A trial where we have to talk about things that no decent woman should know? Where his lawyer makes us look like corrupt daughters trying to kill our own father? Where his friends and associates weigh our word against his?" The futility of normal justice hung over them like a cold, thick fog in the winter. But instead of giving up, Era felt something else in her chest. An anger so strong and focused that it seemed to burn away everything but the need to protect what was left of their family. She thought about Willa upstairs, who was still weak from her seizure and still believed in their father's love, even though he was planning to kill her. "Then we protect ourselves," Ara said, surprised at how steady her voice was. "We can't change what has already happened, but we can stop what he plans to do." Maeve's eyes became sharper with an intelligence that had been hidden for years because she had to obey. "He's getting bolder as Willa gets older. Yesterday I found him standing over her while she slept, saying he was checking her fever, but his hands," she shuddered. "We don't have much time left." As the sisters went about their daily tasks with mechanical efficiency over the next few hours, they began to make plans. Maeve showed that she had been watching her father closely for years, out of a need to survive. She knew that he drank whiskey every night at 9, that he read for an hour before bed in his study, and that he checked the locks on their bedroom door every night, supposedly for their safety, but really to make sure they were still there. "He trusts us because he thinks fear has broken us," Maeve said, as she kneaded the dough for the bread with too much force. "He sees us as cattle, useful for breeding, but not able to really rebel. That blindness will be our weapon." The sisters sat next to Willa's bed and whispered sacred vows to each other after their father had drunk his usual amount of whiskey. They didn't tell their youngest sister anything about what they had found because they wanted to keep her innocence for as long as they could, but they made their deal in front of her, as if her sleeping body gave them strength to carry out their terrible plan. "We won't let him touch you," Ara whispered, holding Willa's hot hand in her own. "Whatever it takes, whatever we have to do, you will be safe." Maeve nodded, and her face changed to show a cold determination that made her look older than her 19 years. "We are his victims for the last time. Tomorrow, we will start planning his death." In the weeks after their midnight agreement, the Ross home became a stage for careful lies. 3 sisters played the roles of good daughters while secretly planning their father's downfall. Every morning, the same things happened. Breakfast was made with steady hands. Scripture was read aloud in voices that didn't show any signs of their inner turmoil. And chores were done with the mechanical precision of women who had learned to survive by becoming invisible. But under this mask of normalcy, a revolution was brewing with the slow, unstoppable force of a storm that was getting stronger. Era studied her mother's herbal remedies with the same focus and dedication as a student getting ready for the most important test of her life. Sarah Ross knew a lot about medicinal plants. This knowledge had been passed down through generations of women who had been the Valley's unofficial healers before Dr. Harwick came with his modern theories and chemical treatments. The leather-bound journal that contained her mother's notes had been relegated to a dusty shelf after Sarah's death, dismissed by Silas as women's superstition. But now, it became Ara's most treasured possession. She slowly figured out her mother's careful handwriting, learning to tell the difference between plants that healed and those that harmed, and between remedies that calmed, and potions that could knock a man out for hours. She discovered that valerian root, when combined with certain mushrooms that grew in the damp hollows near their property, could induce a sleep so deep that even the loudest thunder would fail to wake the sufferer. Ara's mother had used these kinds of mixtures to help with the pain of hard births, but Ara saw them in a whole new way. She went into the woods every afternoon, pretending to be gathering herbs to help Willa get better, her wicker basket slowly filled with things that would not help her get better. She tried out her mixes on their old barn cat first, carefully measuring the doses and timing the effects, like someone who knew their lives depended on getting the math right. The cat came through her tests unharmed, but she got a lot of useful information about potency and duration that she wrote down in code in the margins of her mother's journal. At the same time, Mave became a student of human behavior, using her great intelligence to keep track of every part of her father's daily life. She said that he got up every morning at 5:30, liked his coffee black and his eggs with salt but no pepper, and spent exactly 43 minutes reading the Bible before leaving for the fields. More importantly, she noticed the small changes in his behavior that came before his most violent acts, the way his eyes tightened when he felt his authority was being challenged, the way his voice dropped to a whisper when he was about to hit someone, and the way he flexed his hands before punishing someone. Her observations revealed patterns that had previously been invisible to them, a complex system of triggers and responses that governed their father's behavior like clockwork. She discovered that his violent outbursts typically followed encounters with townspeople who had shown him insufficient deference, that his nocturnal visits to their room increased during the weeks following church board meetings where his authority had been questioned, and that his consumption of whiskey grew heavier when the monthly payments from his sharecroppers fell short of his expectations. Even though Willa was still weak from her seizure, she had a quiet strength that hid her physical weakness. She found ways to help with their plan. Because she looked innocent, she was the perfect observer who could listen at doors and look through keyholes without anyone noticing. She told them about her father's talks with neighbors who came to visit, his letters to family members in far-off towns, and the things she found in locked drawers while cleaning his study with supervision. Their investigation led them straight to Aunt Prudence, their father's oldest sister. She had been kicked out of the family 15 years earlier, but the daughters had never been fully told why. People in the town only talked about her in hushed tones, if they talked about her at all. They said she was a crazy woman who lived alone in a rundown cabin on the far edge of the valley and survived on charity and the questionable money she made by telling fortunes to gullible travelers. It took a lot of planning and bravery to get to Prudence's cabin, because Silas had told them not to talk to his disgraced sister. They waited for a day when he would be gone from dawn to dusk, helping a neighbor who lived a few miles away build a barn. The hike through the woods was hard on Willa's weak body, but she insisted on going with her sisters because she said some truths were too important to hear secondhand. They found Prudence Ross, who now goes by Prudence Blackwood, living in filth that showed she had been deliberately avoiding good people for years. Her gray hair was matted and tangled around her face, which had the unmistakable features of the Ross bloodline, but had been twisted by pain into something almost unrecognizable. When she finally saw her unexpected guests, her eyes had the strange clarity that people who have looked too long into the abyss of human depravity sometimes get. Without any introduction, she said, "You are Sarah's girls." Her voice had the rough edge of someone who didn't have to use it very often. "I see her in your faces, poor thing. Have you come to learn the truth about your family? About what your father really is?" The talk that followed destroyed the last of their hopes about their family's past. Prudence spoke in pieces and didn't make sense. It was clear that whatever had happened to her that led to her exile had hurt her mind. But the most important thing about her testimony was clear. She confirmed everything they had thought. and told them things they had never thought of before. Silas's planned abuse of his sisters, the strange deaths that had gotten rid of possible witnesses, and the careful planning of marriages that would keep him in control of future generations. The torn letter she gave to Ara was written by their grandmother on her deathbed. It was her last confession of the shame that had poisoned their family for decades. The letters inside, written in fading ink and desperate handwriting, gave them the missing pieces of their family's puzzle and confirmed their worst fears about what would happen to them if they didn't act. As the sun began to set, each sister carried the burden of knowledge that had changed them forever on their way home. They were no longer just victims of their father's cruelty. They were now players in a deadly game whose rules they were just starting to figure out. The stress in their home had reached a breaking point, and everyone knew that something had to give soon. Either their father's reign of terror or their own sanity. They knew the time of reckoning was coming and wanted to be ready for it. The storm that hit Havenwood Hollow on the night of October 21st was like the wrath of God. Its winds howled through the valley like the voices of the damned. Lightning split the dark sky into jagged tears that lit up the Ross farmhouse in harsh, unforgiving detail. Thunder rolled across the hills with a force that seemed to shake the ground itself. There was another storm brewing inside the small house. It had been building for weeks and would finally break with results much worse than any natural disaster. Silas Ross was sitting at the head of their scarred wooden table, eating his dinner with the mechanical efficiency of a man who saw eating as just another job that needed to be done. It was just like so many other nights that fall. But Ara could see that he was tense in his shoulders, how his jaw moved as he chewed, and the dangerous sparkle in his eyes that showed he was angry and needed to let it out. That afternoon, the church board met for the month, and she could tell from her father's behavior that things had not gone the way he wanted. The explosion happened out of the blue, and it was caused by something as simple as Willa reaching across the table for the butter dish without asking, which their father had told them to do. His hand hit her cheek with a crack that sounded like the lightning outside. She fell out of her chair and onto the floor, where she lay stunned and bleeding from a split lip. But it wasn't the blow that broke the last bits of control in the house. It was what happened next. Ungrateful little whore. Silas yelled as he got up from his chair slowly, like a predator getting ready to pounce. "Just like your mother, you think you can go against me in my own house." "It's time for you to learn what happens to daughters who forget their place." He was already reaching for his belt when something in Ara's chest exploded with the force of years of anger that had been building up. She put up with his abuse, took his blows, and accepted his insults in the name of family duty and being a good Christian. But seeing him move toward Willa, who was weak and innocent and had never hurt anyone, with that look in his eyes finally made her rage break free. "Don't touch her," Ara heard herself say, and her voice had a tone of authority that seemed to shock everyone. "She hasn't done anything wrong." The beating that followed was brutal, even by Silas Ross's standards. It was fueled by alcohol, hurt pride, and the horrible knowledge that his oldest daughter had finally found the courage to stand up to him. He hit Ara with his fists, feet, and the leather strap that hung next to the fireplace. When he was done, Ara was so hurt that he could barely stand. But when he looked back at Willa, something in Maeve's face must have told him that he was losing control, because he only kicked her a few times before storming upstairs to his study. In the flickering light of the kitchen fire, the sisters tended to each other's wounds. Their hands were gentle, but their eyes were hard, with a determination that had finally turned into deadly purpose. Willa's father's ring left a mark on her face, and Ara's ribs hurt with every breath. Ara was most scared of Maeve, though. She sat still, her dark eyes focused on something none of them could see, and her lips moved as if she were praying or cursing. "Tonight," she said, as the clock struck 9, and they heard their father's heavy footsteps coming down to get his whiskey. "It has to happen tonight, or he will kill one of us before morning." Ara's hand shook as she prepared the fatal drink, adding the carefully measured dose of her herbal concoction to the amber liquid that Silas consumed with religious punctuality. The mixture was clear and almost tasteless, and it was made to work slowly enough that he wouldn't think that his daughters had done anything to make him sleepy. She brought the glass to his office with the practiced respect of a lifetime of training, accepting his grunt of acknowledgement as her due and leaving before he could find new reasons to be violent. They waited in the kitchen while the storm raged outside, counting the minutes until their father's voice grew thick during his usual evening prayers, and then stopped completely. When they finally went upstairs to look, they found him slumped over his Bible, breathing deeply but completely unconscious. For the first time in his adult life, he was vulnerable. It was harder than they thought to move his unconscious body. His dead weight made it so that all three sisters had to work together carefully to get him down the narrow stairs to the cellar without hurting him in a way that might look suspicious later. The storm was the perfect cover for any noise they might make. The howling winds hid the sound of dragging footsteps and muffled conversation. What happened next in the cellar was terrible because it had to happen and terrible because it was the end. Ara had read about the procedures in her mother's medical books and knew that their goal was not to kill their father, but to permanently stop him from committing more crimes. The rough sterilization they did with kitchen knives that had been boiled in water would make sure that Silas Ross could never have children again and could never pass on the twisted legacy that had poisoned their family for generations. The act itself changed them all in ways they could not have predicted. They didn't feel good about their success, and they didn't feel like justice had been served or wrongs had been righted. They didn't feel anything but the terrible knowledge of what they had done and how much it had cost them. They carefully cleaned the cellar, used the same herbs that had knocked their father out to treat his wounds, and made up a story about a farming accident that would explain his injuries without getting them in trouble. When Silas finally woke up 2 days later, weak, confused, and forever changed, he found that his daughters were all together in a wall of silence that he couldn't break through. They told the doctor and the neighbors about the accident with the farm equipment, how they tried to save their father's life, and how thankful they were that God had spared him. And since no one wanted to look too closely at the Ross family's private life, and the other explanations were too horrible to think about, the story became accepted truth. The three sisters sat together in their kitchen on the third night after their terrible deed, listening to their father's weak moans from the bedroom above. They knew they had bought their freedom with the loss of their souls. They weren't victims anymore, but they weren't innocent either. There was no going back for them now. They were bound together not only by blood and shared pain, but also by dark secrets and the knowledge that sometimes survival required the unthinkable. The months after their terrible act of revenge were like a fever dream. Each day blended into the next in a haze of careful performance and hidden fear. Silas Ross lived through his daughter's rough surgery, but the man who came out of those crazy weeks looked very different from the tyrant who had ruled their home with such total power. The physical trauma had made him weak and prone to sudden dizzy spells that made him stumble into furniture. The psychological effects, on the other hand, seemed to have aged him decades in just a few days. His once powerful voice had turned into a shaky whisper, and his hands shook with a palsy that made even the easiest tasks almost impossible. The sisters' story about their father's accident with the hay baler and their desperate attempts to save his life, even though they didn't know much about medicine, was accepted by a community that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. Doctor. Harwick looked at the patient with his usual lack of interest, said that the healing was good enough given the circumstances, and left in a hurry. The neighbors brought casseroles and offered to help, but the sisters politely turned them down. They were curious about what happened in the accident, but the sisters' vague but grateful answers kept them from getting too close. Sheriff Morrison only made one quick visit to look into what he called the unfortunate incident. His questions were vague at best, and he seemed to be asking them more out of a sense of duty than a real desire to know the answers. The sight of three devoted daughters taking care of their hurt father with such care seemed to put to rest any small doubts he may have had. The sisters knew that their community cared more about keeping the peace than finding out the truth when he left without asking for a formal statement or looking at the supposed scene of the accident. But they all had to pay a price for their victory that none of them had fully expected. The guilt that hung over the house was as heavy and suffocating as fog. It affected every conversation and ruined every moment of possible peace. Ara couldn't sleep without seeing her father's unconscious face in those awful moments in the cellar. Maeve, on the other hand, developed a nervous habit of washing her hands until they were raw and bleeding, as if she could scrub away the memory of what those hands had done. Even Willa, who hadn't heard the worst parts of what they did, seemed to know right away that something big had changed in their family. The man who had once scared them now moved around the house like a broken ghost, relying on his daughters for the most basic things in life. They fed him, bathed him, and helped him get dressed and undressed with the same mechanical efficiency as nurses who cared for a patient they didn't love or hate but just put up with. His attempts to regain control were sad, weak demands that were ignored, threats that didn't mean anything, and religious statements made in a voice that shook with doubt. They all knew how ironic it was that by taking away his ability to hurt them, they had also taken full responsibility for his continued existence. As winter turned into spring, the sisters started to talk about their future in quiet conversations, while their father slept or stared blankly out the windows at a world that no longer meant anything to him. They couldn't stay in Havenwood Hollow forever, hiding their secret while pretending to be the same good daughters they had always been. The isolation that had once kept their father's crimes safe now kept their own safe, but it also kept them in a performance that got harder and harder to do every day. The choice to leave came slowly, out of need rather than want. They would put the farm up for sale. Silas couldn't say no, and they could get his signature by tricking him and making him more and more confused about how time was passing. The money would buy them a ticket to a faraway city where 3 sisters caring for their sick father wouldn't draw much attention. They could blend in with the crowds and maybe find some peace. Willa's health got a lot better in the months after their father was neutralized. It was as if his evil presence had allowed her body to start healing itself. The seizures happened less often, her skin looked better, and she started to show a quiet strength that reminded them all of their mother when she was doing well. She worked hard on getting ready for their departure, and her excitement made it seem like she understood, maybe better than her sisters, that their only chance for redemption lay in building something new from the ashes of their old life. The sale of the farm went off without a hitch, thanks to neighbors who were happy to buy the Ross property at a good price and didn't ask many questions about why the family suddenly wanted to move. They told anyone who asked that they were looking for better medical care for their father in the city. People accepted this with the same studied lack of interest that had greeted all of their other lies. The 3 sisters stood together in the yard where they had played as children and looked at the landscape that had shaped their whole lives as they loaded their few belongings into the rented wagon that would take them to the train. The mountains that surrounded the valley looked the same as they always did, eternal and not caring about human suffering. The house itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief when they left. What they did changed them forever, and their terrible secret would always be a part of them in ways that would never fully heal. But they were also free from their father's tyranny, free from the curse of their poisoned bloodline, and free to dream of futures that went beyond just staying alive. They had paid a huge price, not only in terms of their lost innocence, but also in terms of how their souls had changed. They were no longer victims, but they would always wonder if they had become heroes or villains. The sisters didn't look back as the wagon pulled away from Havenwood Hollow, taking them toward an uncertain but self-determined future. They had lived through a lifetime of pain and one terrible act of revenge. There was a chance for redemption ahead, but not through forgiveness, because some things were too bad to be forgiven. Instead, they had to choose to build something good out of the wreckage of their past. They rode in silence, their hands intertwined. They were forever bound by blood and trauma, and the knowledge that sometimes salvation meant having the courage to damn oneself. The road ahead was long and full of unknowns, but it was theirs to take, and that made all the difference.